I'm interested in models, and I don't mean catwalk models, I mean mathematical models that we might program into computers with a series of mathematical equations, complex models of interconnected social and physical processes. So the kinds of models I'm thinking about are the epidemic models that shaped government decisions about lockdowns in response to COVID, climate models that inform us about the potential consequences of our greenhouse gas emissions, maybe also the statistical models that predict which kind of adverts you're most likely to click on when you're browsing the internet, and also weather models that help you decide what to do at the weekend. So what do I mean by good models? Firstly, I mean whether they're able to do what it is that they're trying to do, whether they are good at predicting what happens next when we tell them what's happening at the moment. And secondly, whether these models, the use of these models actually helps to achieve better outcomes in the real world. So as mathematicians and scientists, it can be tempting to spend a long time, thinking about the model and working out the details of what it is that this model does and how it works. But we need to keep in mind that the use of the model and all of its benefits are really in how it helps us to make decisions in the real world. So we're looking at models like these in the LSE Data Science Institute, which is a new interdisciplinary institute for data science with a focus on the social, economic and political aspects of data in the 21st century. So one example of the kinds of models that I'm looking at in my research is climate models. How can we know the level of confidence that we should have in different kinds of climate projections when we're planning for the future? We want to make adaptation decisions, like how to decide whether to build new reservoirs or how coastal communities can plan for sea level rise. And that information necessarily comes from models because we don't have observations of the future yet. So it's really important to be clear about the levels of confidence that we have in these different projections and how we can and can't use that information. So then the same goes for economic models. How do governments and central banks use the information that we get from this kind of model to determine policies? How do their decisions change the outcomes? And then how do the net effects of whole populations reacting and responding to these decisions change the outcomes even more? So then the same also goes for epidemic models of the coronavirus pandemic. How do we use these models to determine the kind of policies that we want to enact in order to achieve the kind of outcomes that we want to achieve? So obviously there are different questions here. First is, what are the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And then how do we design our models in order to make them informative about the kinds of things that we're actually interested in? So thinking about COVID modelling, for example, many models have been in the news, and we've heard about ones which show graphs of the number of people that would be affected by COVID, the number of people that might be taking up hospital beds, and the number of people that might sadly die from the pandemic. And when we use these kinds of models, it shapes the way that we think about the pandemic because it focuses our attention on certain aspects. It focuses our attention, for instance, certainly in the UK, on the way that the possibility for the NHS services to become overwhelmed. And of course, that's extremely important, and it's something that the models have rightly focused upon. But when we construct these models, there are also things that we leave out that may also be important, but may then get less policy attention than they deserve. So, for example, we might think of the economic consequences of COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns. We might also think of mental health and the ongoing impacts of loss of education for children and young people. So the point is that the model is interacting with our thinking about the pandemic, and it's shaping the way that we frame it and the way that we respond to it. So in my research program, I'm looking at how scientists and decision makers use models and the interaction between scientist, decision maker, and this sort of abstract entity, which is the model, which really does have a life of its own. It performs a function of sort of facilitating a conversation, mediating between these different stakeholders in a decision, and also framing the degree of importance that we attach to each of the different contributing factors. So I'm interested then in the ethical implications of these kind of decisions that are taken about how we make models and how we use models. I think what we need is to see a wider conversation both within the scientific and decision-making communities about how we use models, but also more diversity in these models, more sort of, instead of looking for the single best model that we can make, and pouring all of our computational resource perhaps and all of our scientific person power into making one particularly good model. Let's have lots of models. Let's have lots of different models that emphasize different aspects of the problem, accepting that none of them is going to give us full information about absolutely everything, but that all of these might be useful things to take into account when we're coming to a decision. So when I say we need to do good science with models, one of the things that I mean is we need to be clear about the relationship between the model world and the real world. Instead of spending lots of time quantifying lots of statistics in model land, we need to be making more nuanced judgments about the way it is that these statistics in model land are relevant for the real world. Whether indeed the statistics are relevant at all, or actually what it is that we're getting out of our model is insight. Is it patterns? Is it an understanding of the relationships between different factors? Maybe we can't make a prediction, but we can understand some of the underlying processes, and that will help us to understand what's going on and therefore think about how it is that we are intervening in a system, whether it's the climate system or the progress of a pandemic or economic policy. It's also important to ensure that our models are transparent and accountable about the value systems that are embedded in them. So, for example, we've heard a lot in the last few years about the transparency and accountability and perhaps the bias of algorithmic decision-making processes. Think about criminal sentencing, which might be shown to have a racist bias. I think that models are potentially subject to the same kinds of biases, although they are more hidden in the sort of scientific mechanisms that underlie these models. So we need to be really careful about interrogating those kind of value judgments, ensuring that they are brought to the surface, and making sure that we're not inadvertently creating any kind of biased or unfair procedures. One of the reasons this is particularly important is because if we fail to understand this distinction between model land and real world, and if we fail to understand the degree to which our value judgments might be influencing the potential outcomes that we're getting from our models, it will make us overconfident almost all the time in the predictions that we are making with these models. And so that exposes us to more risk, whether that's the risk of being overconfident about the likely outcomes of climate change and therefore over-optimizing our adaptation plans, or whether that's the risk of thinking we know what's going to happen in the economy in future and over-optimizing our financial planning. What we need to do is understand that there is a degree of irreducible uncertainty here. There are things that we simply can't know about the future, and no model is going to help us to be able to predict that quantitatively, however good it is. And so stepping back a little and saying, there is risk here, there is deep uncertainty, there are things that we simply can't know, but we still have useful information from these models because these models are telling us how to think about it and how to understand it. They are giving us insight about the underlying processes that might help us make better decisions. What these models are effectively doing is they are taking on the role of experts. Now, they're not replacing experts, they work with experts. The expert has an idea of how the system works and they program it into some sort of model, and the model helps the expert to understand more about the system, and they then take that back into their insight and understanding of what's going on and the recommendations that they might make. But I think what we need to be careful here with is the transparency and accountability again. Somebody recently said the British people have had enough of experts, and I think that speaks to a sort of increasing skepticism about the ways that experts and models and scientific procedures more generally perhaps are helping to inform decision making and whether they are genuinely doing a good job of that. So that again speaks to the need to think more carefully about the value judgments that are within these models. Are we accidentally embedding one particular perspective? Should we be thinking about trying to incorporate more of a diversity of views here? So for anyone using models, I think the take-homes here are not that we should throw our models away and not that they're not useful, but that we need to be really careful in how we think about them and to step back, take a step back and say, if I'm not necessarily getting quantitative information that is perfect predictions here, I'm getting something which is an indication. It might be insight, it might be useful understanding of how this system works, which I can then take to inform decision making. But I need to be really careful about communicating that in a way that reflects the potential underlying uncertainties both within the model and in the gap between the model land and the real world. So I think models are already shaping our world, both post-COVID, pre-COVID, and during COVID, as we've seen. And what I'm really interested in is ensuring that we do good science with our models to ensure that we have diversity, transparency, and accountability, and that we are really assessing risk in the best possible way and helping to contribute to making the best possible decisions. That's the role of models, and that's how models can help shape the post-COVID world.